This is an I Am Listening original podcast.
I think you're right that it's a long-term programme, but there are immediate things that can be done where successive governments have made commitments, and those things just haven't come to fruition. So I think there is the political will, but there's also the question of funding, where the money comes from, how you raise funds in order to support housing programs. And within the business, what we want is a more balanced and accessible housing market.
Welcome to Series 2 of the Property Podcast with Wards and me, Gary Wilson, the weekly podcast where I'll share with you all the latest Kent property news, as well as speaking with industry professionals to offer advice and tips that will hopefully help make your house move journey a little less stressful. Welcome to part 1 of a special 2-part episode of the Property Podcast with Wards, Series 2. For this episode, I sat down with some very special guests from Wards to discuss how the UK government could do better to help the housing market. With me in the studio for this conversation were S02E08, Group Managing Director, Jason Bunning, Managing Director of Operations, James Stefani, Lettings Business Development Director, Gavin Welch, Financial Services Director, and Neil Piper, Senior Operations Director. Enjoy the first part of our conversation. What would a 10-year cross-party property manifesto look like? What could a government do to help? What rules, regulations, changes, things improving, moving, changing? Where should we start?
So I think the first thing I would say is that 10 years isn't long enough. I think probably in order to make any meaningful difference, I think you've got to be looking at 25 years as a strategic plan that's agreed cross-party. I think the problem with the housing market is it's such a long-term issue, and it should be something that politics is taken out of. I think that's the most important thing. I think we've had a revolving door of housing ministers. There's no continuity from one government to the next. And I think if we're going to make any difference, it's got to be something that is non-political, a cross-party agreement. That's the nirvana, really. That's really where we want to get to. And it's got to be something that's really strategic across letting, across social housing, across, first-time buyers, the whole piece. I think it's all got to join up. But whether there's any will to do that is a completely different matter, I think.
I think, Jace, there is a will to do it. I think you're right that it's a long-term programme, but there are immediate things that can be done where successive governments have made commitments, and those things just haven't come to fruition. So I think there is the political will, but there's also the question of funding, where the money comes from, how you raise funds in order to support housing programs. And within the business, what we want is a more balanced and accessible housing market. So we are working in industry which is blighted by peaks and troughs, and we have to navigate our way around that. And what would be lovely would be to have a more balanced approach to the business, making it more accessible for people, and also providing a more stable environment for long-term home ownership.
I think that's key, Aldo, isn't it? I think feels like there's been a lot of meddling with the market, and the problem with governments meddling with the market is it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty, that's uncertainty with developers. Developers are sat on thousands and thousands of land banks that they're not doing anything with, and one of the reasons they're not doing anything with those land banks is because they don't know what's coming next. So I think there does need to be a longer strategy, and I think there's got to be less meddling with the market so people can have a clear view on what's ahead.
Is there any sort of history of a more stable market? And if so, what's the difference between that point and now? Or are we talking a sort of dream scenario? There's never really been a stable situation. Is it like you use the word nirvana? Is it really like that? Is it something that you feel could happen, or are we just trying to get as close to it as we can?
I don't think we've ever had a period where there's been long-term stability, because what impacts on the housing market is affordability, interest rate, economic conditions that determine the numbers of new people that are in a position where they can get the whole thing about employment. So those are economic and political things that are out of our control. So it's like saying, is there a stable economy? And of course, because the economy isn't stable, the housing market is reflective of that, of those peaks and troughs, really, from an economic perspective.
I think a problem at the moment is how a young person in their 20s or even 30s might feel at the moment. And I think for a lot of them, they would feel that home ownership is now unattainable. And I think an objective would be to break that, so a young person feels actually that is within reach. And I think the way to do that is to build more houses. And I know that is part of the new government's policy, but we need to find a way of delivering houses quicker, and that might involve incentivising developers on delivery. But also finding a way of building houses cheaper. And my suggestion would be that you use some of the prison population to upskill them to build property, build houses, and that would also give them a clear skill to use when they're released from prisons.
Yeah, well, there is this whole early release thing, which is
that's very topical, isn't it?
Very, very topical. And the main thing with that, apart from obviously people's fears of people being out who shouldn't be out, is that actually they've got nothing to go out to.
They've got no home.
That's the big problem. They go back to having no home and no job, and so it goes round. So, that seems like something that could well be on the agenda. If we were breaking it down, if it's possible, obviously, as you've already mentioned, the whole of the economy is all linked, and the housing market obviously is a huge part of that. But if you could break it down into a way to help the various parts of the industry and parts of the business, buyers, sellers, tenants, landlords, is that doable? Can you give us a sort of, let's pick the first one there, buyers, for example. So to break it down for people listening to this podcast, they're buyers or want to be buyers at least. What change could we make for them? Obviously, like I say, it's all interrelated, but if there was something that was specifically more for buyers, what could you...
It's interesting, Gary. It's a question I get asked a lot of the time is how do you get young people on the housing ladder? What can they do to build up their savings? Because if you're looking at the lifetime ISAs that's available, maximum you can put in that is £4,000. If you're in a partnership, you've got to wait 3 or 4 years before you've even got enough to raise a 5 to 10% deposit. So there must be something we can do, or the government can do, or lenders together to help first-time buyers get that money together. It's all well and good those people that perhaps have got bank of mum and dad, but what about others that haven't? And until we can get people with the right deposits and the right ability to buy, we've got nobody coming through from the bottom end up.
But you've still got a problem where you've got a lot of those would-be buyers aren't able to save for a deposit.
Correct.
Because all of their money's going on rent.
And I think that's part of the problem. So I read something the other day. In the 1990s, it was 3 years to save an average deposit. Yeah. As it stands now, it's 13 years. So unless you've got something major that's happening to get first-time buyers moving, which is how you get the housing market moving, it's got to start somewhere. Yeah. There needs to be some imaginative thinking around the way that we allow people to finance properties. We're talking longer-term mortgages to keep the costs down, but you've got to get that entry point correct. And I think that's part of the assistance that government could provide, potentially underwriting deposits for people to get out of rented accommodation into homes, so creating a bond, which is a similar thing that they've done in France. So it just takes the imagination and, not necessarily the money, it's underwriting money that other people are going to lend, because it's all in the lender's interest to get this money lent out and, create mortgages. It's just having the ability to underwrite what they're putting in place. So that's one potential solution.
Also, there are existing schemes, they're just not particularly well publicised. So there's currently a home, first-time buyer home buy programme, where if you're buying a new home, you can purchase that property between 30 and 50% below the market value if it's a new home. That's not particularly well publicised, And not all developers are signed up to that. So there could be additional incentives to ensure that all new home builders were providing that assistance, which is government funded. Then you've solved the problem with the deposit, and you've also solved the problem with the entry point based on affordability.
But there's also problems with the exit point with that, in that with the current scheme, the property can only be sold to somebody else taking the scheme, or...
Yes. And Neil, that's the point I was coming on to, because my view is that the government could extend that to second homes. So at the moment, that scheme, which isn't particularly well publicised, is just for new homes. Why not extend it to the second-hand market?
Which you probably could do.
That opens up the floodgates completely with regards to affordable housing supply. And so I don't really understand why the government aren't at least considering or flirting with opening that, because that would be a massive gateway to making new and second homes more affordable to first-time buyers, which is the biggest issue. The other point, and Gab, you'll be familiar with this, is the mortgage lending scheme, 95% guarantee that the government provides to mortgage lenders. That's due to be withdrawn, I think, in June of 2025. So actually there's a scheme in place that has got some legs, and that's due to be withdrawn next year without any discussion about what might be in place in order to support first-time buyers, based on the fact that that scheme could be withdrawn from the market, which seems crazy to me.
It's the same as the Help to Buy scheme. It came and went, and with no plan behind it. And we know when the end date is, but what's to replace it? And that doesn't give anybody any stability.
They could bring back Help to Buy. That would be a positive move.
Well, we know that probably 50% of the properties that we sold that were new homes were supported with the government Help to Buy scheme. Yeah. So that had a massive impact on the turnover and volumes of sales to first-time buyers. And the introduction of the home buy programme wasn't a great solution for that particular scheme.
Yeah, and it was also best kept secret, wasn't it?
Well, the fact that we're talking about it, but actually it's not particularly well understood within the marketplace.
As Kent's local independent estate agent, Wards utilise years of experience and expertise to promote your property in the best possible light to the largest possible audience. For more information, receive an online valuation in less than 30 seconds or book an in-person appraisal of your property with us today, head over to wardsofkent.co.uk to find out more about our unique approach.
What's it like feeding back? Obviously, you have trade bodies and industry bodies that do this kind of thing, but from Ward's point of view and other businesses you work with in the same line of work as you, do they get good feedback from you guys? I'm sure you're willing to give good feedback, but do they take it? Is there a good way of you saying, this really worked, you're crazy if you cut this next June or whatever?
I think there's a lot of rhetoric. We don't get invited specifically to comment on these sort of higher level matters. Certainly we'd love the opportunity of participating more readily on, practical aspects of improving the housing market. And, we talk a lot about keeping things simple. Every time we look at different schemes, they are so complicated. And as a result of those complications, they either don't get picked up or they're not effective. So my advice is keep it really simple. There are simple solutions that then become politically more complicated. And as a result of that, you get an ineffective solution from what initially might be a great idea. Yeah. There's lots of great ideas just to come to
usually to listen more.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also don't think it's all down to government. I think the industry as a whole has got a responsibility for some brave thinking, particularly new homes. So I think they're sitting on stocks of properties that are not selling as quickly as perhaps they'd like. And I think if with a bit of imagination and joining the dots up between some of the lenders and the stock that they want to shift, I think there could be the market might be able to provide some solutions, but the willingness to do that is perhaps affected by waiting for the government to do things for them. So, whether there could be reduced deposits for some of the new homes we're trying to sell or developers are trying to sell, but in a joined up way so that there is a help to buy, but it's provided by the market. So I don't think all the answers can come from government. The government have got, a massive amount of pressure on the public purse strings. But I think the understanding that the housing market seeds so much employment and prosperity within the country is a really good starting point. I think if we can get the housing market moving in a healthy, consistent way, then I think that's the key to unlocking the growth that this new government's talking about. If they can't provide the growth, then there'll be no money for the NHS, there's no money for prisons or any of the other pressures they're under at the moment, I think.
If we break it down further, is it possible to break it down? Obviously, we came in on buyers there, and as I say, it's all interconnected, very much so. I love what you've talked about. It covers everyone, but any of you guys want to sort of think about sellers or tenants or landlords, sort of specifically how they could be helped to then help the market move forward?
I think one of the issues is the proportion of vacant properties that aren't being repurposed for affordable housing. So I think, Neil, you mentioned it earlier, but I think there's a massive amount that could be done to introduce maybe vacancy taxes so that people that have inherited or speculative buyers have properties that just sit there. And that if vacancy taxes were applied, that would be an incentive for those investors to build out those developments, and that would create more affordable housing. That could also be funded. There could be local initiatives that help support that. So it does seem sacrilege that we have hundreds of thousands of empty properties that are just sitting there that no one is benefiting from. And there needs to be tighter control and regulations on that sort of speculative investment.
Probably an easy win for the government, that one as well. An empty homes tax would probably be well received by the vast majority. Shall I be the first to mention stamp duty?
I think we've all been waiting for that moment. Let's bring it on.
Well, it needs reforming.
Yes.
I think stamp duty used to be one of the simplest taxes to understand. It's now probably one of the most complicated. So I think I wouldn't want to be asked the question, if you were buying a house for $620,000, how much stamp duty would you pay? Because without a stamp duty calculator now, I don't know. And I think it needs looking at. I think it needs to be simplified. I think there needs to be additional concessions. They're already there, but additional concessions at the bottom end. And I think there's an argument for making concessions at the top end as well. And by the top end, I mean maybe looking at perhaps abolishing stamp duty for over 60s, maybe over 70s.
I think I'm right in saying that the stamp duty threshold for first-time buyers is at 250,000 and higher for London. So that 250 threshold isn't high enough.
No, agreed.
So you can't, in fairness, you can't get a lot for £250,000.
No,
certainly in the southeast of England. So perhaps in other parts of the country that might be more affordable. But I think there are ways of maybe funding that stamp duty threshold changes, because if you look at the proportion of overseas buyers, as an overseas buyer, you would pay an extra premium on purchase tax, I think, for 2%, correct me if I'm wrong. In other countries, you would be paying up to 10%.
Right.
So I believe there are opportunities to raise taxes with overseas investors, and that additional money to help fund improving thresholds for first-time buyers. So it's just repurposing money that I believe is viable from a taxation point of view, and use that for the people that need it most.
We've talked also about all of this being linked quite closely to the economy, and one of the ways to improve the economy is to drive more building work through properties, energy efficiency work. So you're looking at energy efficiency standards which are quite heavily scrutinised in the rental market. Why not open that a bit more to the whole of the housing market? So you could link the energy efficiency rating of a property to the stamp duty you pay. That would incentivise sellers perhaps to improve the energy efficiency of their property to make the property more attractive to their buyers. Buyers would be drawn towards the most energy efficiency properties, and that creates movement within that sector as well to start to move the economy forwards.
And there's an argument for that with council tax as well. So one of the big money makers for the government would be to review council tax rates, which haven't been looked at since 1990. And the energy efficiency being a discount on your council tax will be another way of raising money if you had a black hole from making changes to the stamp duty. Neil, you mentioned earlier about maybe age ranges for stamp duty. I think it's probably simpler than that, and we need to free up stock and giving a stamp duty holiday to downsizers. I think that's a straightforward thing. So whether you're 50 or 70, if you're downsizing, you're freeing up some bedrooms for a family where you're a couple empty nesters effectively. I think that creates some supply that isn't there at the moment if you've got to pay 30, 40, 50,000. So we need to incentivise that. I think the energy efficient incentives are are really important. And I think, developing brownfield sites is equally important as well. I think if you had zero stamp duty on buying one of these properties that perhaps isn't that attractive in terms of where it is, because brownfield sites tend to be in built-up areas, it's disused factories and so on. If there was zero stamp, it would make it more attractive and get these properties sold. Perhaps at a bit more of a premium, and developers will be more interested in doing that kind of thing. So I think it again, all of this comes down to a bit of blue sky thinking, effectively, and doing the unthinkable in some cases, starting from scratch. And I think that's the brave thinking that you need to have if you're going to make any meaningful change.
Jace, that also touches on relaxing zoning laws. So if you look at new development, perhaps relaxing those regulations around high density and mixed use so that you have better repurposing of the land that's available. So in reality, I don't think there's any shortage of land. What there is a very complicated permitting process that successive governments have said they're going to do something about. But every time we come up with that more sort of red tape that gets in the way of a great idea. So I think reducing red tape would solve a lot of the problems, whether it's actually within the rental sector or actually, residential housing sector as well.
Just coming back to your point about the green side of this, James, you're 100% right. Lenders are already getting on board. There are lenders that are offering cash back for you to upgrade your house when you move in to be more energy efficient. So Jason's dotted line to the lenders is already there.
Yeah,
in some aspects.
It's not particularly well publicised.
No, I've seen green deals for mortgages as well, slightly lower rates for more energy efficiency properties.
Don't forget, it's always a good idea to consult with a financial advisor, solicitor and estate agent to help you navigate the home buying process and answer any additional questions you may have. Thanks again to all our special guests for their insights and expertise. You can check out this episode and previous episodes at im-listening.co.uk or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out the Property Podcast with Wards next week for part 2 of this conversation and the final episode of the series. See you then. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast with Wards. If you'd like more information on the subjects that we've covered in this week's episode, just head over to the Wards website at wardsofkent.co.uk, or you can follow us on our social media channels. You can check out our latest episodes at im-listening.co.uk or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
This has been an I Am Listening exclusive podcast. For more information, head over to our website, im-listening.co.uk.